"Can you be quiet and let the professionals speak?" The words sliced through the morning air on a construction site just outside of Grandstone, silencing everyone in an instant. Connor Whitman, a 38-year-old white chief engineer with an MIT degree and an ego to match, turned sharply to face Malik Grayson, a 45-year-old black construction worker whose calloused hands told the story of nearly 25 years on job sites. The tension crackled as every head turned toward Malik, who had calmly pointed out a critical imbalance in the foundation's load distribution, only to be publicly humiliated for stepping out of line. To Connor, it didn't matter that Malik's observation could prevent a future collapse. All he saw was a man in a dusty vest, not a diploma on a wall. Around them, junior engineers glanced nervously, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. To some, it was just another day on site. But for Malik, who stood his ground with quiet dignity, this was the moment the real project began, one that wouldn't just involve concrete and steel, but would shake the very foundation of arrogance, bias, and hidden identity. The project was a towering 28-story commercial complex known as Grandstone Square, one of the largest construction endeavors in the state, overseen by the prestigious Novatech Structures. The site buzzed with activity, from cement trucks rumbling in and out to architects shouting measurements across steel beams. Among the dozens of workers in safety vests and hard hats was Malik Grayson, a quiet, unassuming construction laborer whose steady presence had become a fixture on the site. Living in a modest apartment across town and keeping mostly to himself, Malik was seen as just another seasoned pair of hands. One who showed up early, worked hard, and left without a fuss. No one asked much about his past, and he didn't offer it. But Malik saw everything. He studied blueprints when no one was looking, took notes in a battered notebook during lunch breaks, and paid careful attention to the subtleties of the land they were building on. Connor Whitman, on the other hand, was anything but modest. At 38, the newly appointed chief engineer had just transferred from Novatech's New York office, carrying with him an Ivy League resume and an attitude sharpened by years of climbing corporate ladders. His arrival came with fanfare, brand new SUV, monogrammed laptop bag, and a reputation for getting things done fast. But beneath the polished exterior was a man who wore arrogance like a badge of honor. He barked orders, dismissed suggestions, and carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone who believed respect came with titles, not earned through humility. And nothing irritated Connor more than a laborer who dared to think. So when Malik approached him one morning, holding a hand-sketched diagram and pointing out a concern about the northeast quadrant of the site, where the soil composition suggested potential for uneven settling, Connor didn't even glance at the paper. He smirked and raised his voice so everyone could hear. Workers should stick to mixing concrete, not pretending to understand what takes years of training to learn, he said with a mocking smile. Laughter rippled through a few of the younger engineers, more out of nervousness than agreement. Malik stood still, his eyes calm, his hand still holding the diagram. He didn't retaliate or argue. He simply nodded, folded the paper, and walked away, the sting of humiliation sharp, but not unfamiliar. What Connor failed to notice at that moment was the way the veteran workers quietly turned their heads away in discomfort, or the way one of the junior engineers glanced at Malik with something that looked a lot like regret. What Connor also didn't know was that Malik wasn't just any construction worker. And while the site was busy laying foundations of steel and cement, Malik had already begun laying a very different kind of foundation. One built from patience, strategy, and a truth that would soon flip the entire project, and Connor's career on its head. Connor, still basking in the authority of his title, dismissed Malik's warning entirely, waving it off as fear mongering from someone without the credentials to understand risk assessment. He called an emergency meeting that afternoon and instructed the team to move forward with the revised plan, one that conveniently cut costs by eliminating several soil reinforcement measures. The younger engineers exchanged uncertain glances, some of them visibly uncomfortable with the changes, but none dared to challenge him. Connor's tone made it clear hesitation would be interpreted as insubordination. The foundation work resumed, and Malik, now relegated to the background, returned to stacking bricks in silence. But beneath that quiet demeanor, something had shifted. As the crew broke for lunch, Malik stepped behind a stack of materials, pulled out a weathered flip phone from his pocket, and typed a brief message. The text, sent to someone named Elise, was simple: "Activate Phase 2. He closed the phone without a word, slipped it back into his vest, and returned to his duties as if nothing had happened. The next morning, just as the site began its usual routine of drills, cranes, and clipped walkie-talkie chatter, an unusual buzz swept through the administrative office. A mass email had landed in everyone's inbox at 6:13 a.m., marked with the Novatech corporate seal and labeled urgent. It read, "The new CEO will conduct a surprise on-site evaluation at Grandstone Square today. Please prepare full compliance reports and safety documentation for review." At first, most brushed it off. Another upper management stunt. But Connor's reaction was instant and visceral. His confidence faltered for a brief second, then quickly reshaped itself into the manic urgency of a man who suddenly realized just how many corners he'd cut. "Get this place spotless," he barked, his voice rising. "Clear out unused materials, align the hazard signage, and for God's sake, make sure everyone's in full PPE." He clutched his tablet like a lifeline, scrolling through project notes and budgets, muttering under his breath about timing, optics, and projections. He paced the site like a general before inspection, barking orders to foremen and snapping at junior staff. But under the surface, worry gnawed at him. He had approved changes to critical sections of the foundation, alterations that weren't exactly in line with corporate protocol. And though he'd instructed the administrative assistant to clean up the paperwork, there were still potential gaps someone with authority could find. Still, Connor reassured himself with the same arrogance that had fueled his rise. CEOs don't walk construction sites, he told himself, and if they do, they don't get into the weeds. This would be a handshake, a few compliments, and maybe a photo op for the newsletter. No one would look too closely. After all, who would question a Stanford-educated chief engineer backed by 2 decades of experience and a track record of early project completions? As Connor adjusted his tie and reapplied his cologne in the rearview mirror of his SUV, he had no idea that the man about to step onto the job site knew every inch of it more intimately than he ever would. And that the evaluation wasn't just a surprise check-in, but the next move in a plan set into motion long before Connor had ever arrived in Grandstone. The black Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled slowly onto the construction lot, its sleek exterior gleaming under the midday sun. Dust swirled as workers paused to watch, murmurs rippling through the site. Connor Whitman straightened his collar, adjusted his posture, and marched confidently toward the car, hand outstretched, his best CEO-ready smile plastered across his face. He assumed, of course, that a well-dressed white executive would step out, maybe some older man with a firm handshake and a briefcase full of numbers. The chauffeur exited first, opening the back door with a practiced motion. But the man who emerged was not what anyone expected. Dressed in a crisp black tailored suit, dark sunglasses, and leather Oxford shoes that glinted in the light, Malik Grayson stepped out slowly, his presence commanding immediate silence. The transformation was breathtaking. Gone was the dusty vest, the calloused hands gripping trowels. This man exuded power, dignity, and control. Connor froze mid-step, his hand still in the air. A hush fell over the entire site. Engineers, foremen, and laborers alike stared in stunned disbelief. Malik calmly removed his sunglasses, looked Connor directly in the eyes, and said with deliberate clarity, "Allow me to formally introduce myself. I'm Malik Ezekiel Grayson, Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of Novatech Structures." The words landed like a wrecking ball. Connor's arm dropped to his side. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face turned a shade paler, the blood draining under the weight of his realization. Around him, the staff stood motionless, caught between awe and awkwardness, their gazes darting from Malik to Connor and back again. The very man Connor had belittled, ignored, and dismissed as just a worker had in fact been evaluating him all along. Every condescending comment, every arrogant dismissal of safety warnings, every subtle reinforcement of a hierarchy rooted more in prejudice than merit. It had all unfolded in front of the one person who held the power to decide his future. Malik, unfazed by the stares, stepped forward with measured confidence, surveying the site with the quiet authority of someone who had not only built this company, but understood it from the ground up, literally. One of the assistant engineers took an involuntary step backward, mumbling, "No way, he's the CEO?" Another, unable to look Connor in the eye, simply nodded in quiet affirmation. Malik's voice remained calm but resolute. "I've spent the last 4 weeks on site, observing how this team functions under pressure, how concerns are handled, and how leadership is exercised. I came here not just to inspect concrete and steel, but to understand the culture that holds them together, or threatens to tear them apart." The air was thick with tension. Connor attempted a desperate recovery, his voice shaky. "Mr. Grayson, sir, I didn't realize. If I had known—" But Malik held up one hand, silencing him. "That's exactly the problem, Mr. Whitman," he said, his tone icy but professional. "If you had known who I was, you would have listened. But because you thought I was beneath you, you felt entitled to disrespect me and dismiss potentially life-saving feedback. That tells me everything I need to know, not about your engineering skills, but about your character." Behind him, Elise, now clearly revealed to be Malik's executive assistant, stepped forward, clipboard in hand. She handed Malik a manila folder, which he took without looking. "We'll talk more in the trailer," Malik said, before turning to address the rest of the staff. "For now, let's get back to work. We have buildings to raise and standards to uphold." Inside the executive trailer, the air was stifling, not from the heat, but from the unspoken weight of consequences hanging over every second. Connor sat stiffly at the far end of the long conference table, flanked by his engineering team, most of whom now wore expressions of unease rather than loyalty. Across from him stood Malik Grayson, no longer just a name on a paycheck, but a force neither of them could ignore. Elise, who only days before had been hauling equipment and taking silent notes in the field, now stood beside Malik in a sharp blazer, projecting confidence with every click of her pen. What Connor hadn't known, what no one on site had known, was that Malik hadn't always been a CEO. He had once served as a decorated structural engineer in the US Army, overseeing military base infrastructure projects in conflict zones. But after being passed over repeatedly for promotions, despite flawless performance evaluations, he had walked away, tired of the glass ceilings wrapped in polite excuses. Using a modest inheritance from his late father, a Vietnam War veteran, Malik had built Novatech structures from the ground up, literally and figuratively. The company had been his answer to a broken system, a place where talent mattered more than skin tone or social pedigree. Now, facing Connor across the table, Malik didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Before we move forward," he said, nodding to Elise, "I think it's important that we all hear the reality of what's been happening here." Elise tapped a button on her tablet, and the trailer filled with Connor's unmistakable voice, sarcastic, dismissive, and layered with entitlement. "We don't need input from laborers who don't even know how to read a blueprint," the recording played. "Let's leave the engineering to the ones who actually earned their degrees." A few gasps escaped from the staff as their eyes darted toward Connor, whose face had drained of all color. Malik stood motionless, letting the silence after the playback speak louder than any reprimand. Then he said, "This company was founded on the principle that we build more than structures, we build respect. And I refuse to let arrogance and prejudice become part of our foundation." He turned to Connor and placed a folder on the table. Inside was a comprehensive audit compiled by Elise, evidence of ignored safety protocols, unauthorized material substitutions, and reckless cost-cutting that jeopardized the integrity of the building's northeast foundation. "Connor Whitman," Malik said with calm authority, "effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties. However, I believe in accountability over destruction, in education over humiliation. So I'm offering you a choice." He paused, giving Connor a moment to look up. Option 1, formal termination for cause, with a full report sent to the state licensing board, likely resulting in the revocation of your professional credentials. Option 2, a 1-year commitment as a volunteer instructor in Novatech's community training program for underrepresented youth. You will teach what you know, not from a pedestal, but from the ground, where real learning begins. Connor stared at the folder, speechless, his mind racing between indignation and fear. Malik didn't press him for an answer. "You have until the end of the day," he added. "What you choose now won't just define your career, it will define your character." Then, with a nod to Elise, Malik turned toward the trailer door, leaving behind not just a fired engineer, but the rubble of a broken ego, and the chance, however small, for redemption. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Malik Grayson stepped into Novatech's Community Training Center, a renovated warehouse turned state-of-the-art education facility nestled in the heart of the city's industrial district. The hum of activity filled the air, power tools buzzed, chalk scraped across whiteboards, and eager voices echoed through high ceilings. As Malik walked through the main corridor, he paused outside Classroom C. Through the glass window, he spotted a familiar figure standing before a half-circle of students, young men and women, most of them from marginalized backgrounds, their eyes locked on the instructor with intense focus. It was Connor Whitman, but the version Malik saw now bore little resemblance to the man who once strutted across a job site in designer loafers and smug certainty. Connor looked leaner, his posture more grounded. He wore a simple work shirt, sleeves rolled up, graphite smudges on his forearm. On the table beside him was a detailed model of a foundation system, which he was patiently explaining to a teenage girl holding a ruler and an unsure smile. The students weren't just listening, they were engaged, asking questions, pushing back, challenging assumptions. And Connor welcomed it all. Malik stepped inside quietly, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. When the class concluded, Connor turned and met Malik's gaze. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by something more sincere. Relief, maybe even gratitude. He approached slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, and nodded. "Didn't expect to see you today," he said. "I figured you had more important places to be." Malik smiled faintly. "This is one of the most important places I could be." They stood in a silence that was no longer tense, but reflective. Finally, Connor spoke, his voice lower, steadier than before. "You know, I used to believe my degrees, my titles, they were everything. Proof that I had earned the right to speak, to lead, to dismiss. But the kids here, they've taught me more in 6 months than any textbook ever did." He looked back at the empty chairs where names were still scribbled on nameplates in marker. "I realized that respect doesn't come from what's on your resume, it comes from owning your mistakes, from listening." Malik studied him for a moment, then nodded. "And that realization," he said quietly, "makes you more qualified than you ever were before." Connor let out a soft chuckle, not from pride, but from the humility he'd only recently learned to embrace. "Some days, I still feel like I'm making up for it," he admitted. "But then one of these kids builds something from scratch, and I see that spark, and I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Malik clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You chose growth over pride. That's more than most people ever do." As Malik turned to leave, he paused at the doorway and looked back. "You planning to stay on when your year's up?" Connor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I already asked Elise if I could extend. There's a student named Luis. I think he's got a real shot at becoming an engineer. I'd like to see him through." Malik's smile deepened. In that moment, there were no CEOs or fallen engineers, just two men who had both, in different ways, come full circle. Months later, the Grandstone Square Tower stood tall against the city skyline, a gleaming 28-story marvel of engineering that far exceeded initial expectations. But it wasn't just the steel, glass, or cutting-edge design that earned it praise. What truly set it apart was the story behind its foundation, not just in the physical sense, but in the cultural one. Workers, engineers, community leaders, and even students from Novatech's training program gathered on opening day, not only to celebrate the structure's completion, but to honor the transformation that had made it possible. Inside the building's main lobby, above polished floors and beside towering glass windows, hung a brushed steel plaque engraved with a single quote. "Strong architecture begins at the foundation, and the foundation of every structure is human dignity." Those words, chosen by Malik Grayson himself, served as both a reminder and a challenge to everyone who passed through the space. They spoke not only to engineering principles, but to the company's renewed ethos, one where every voice mattered and where respect wasn't earned through status, but extended as a basic human right. Connor Whitman stood in the crowd that day, no longer in a suit, but in a simple collared shirt, surrounded by his students. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes reflected something far greater than regret. It reflected understanding. The lesson learned from this story is a powerful one, rooted in both humility and growth. Never judge someone by the clothes they wear or the job they hold. Beneath a hard hat or a dusty vest may lie a mind capable of changing the world. A single careless remark made in arrogance or haste can destroy a career. But the ability to own one's mistakes and choose redemption over ego can rebuild a future stronger than before. Real knowledge doesn't only come from ivy-covered campuses or framed diplomas. It often lives in the hands of those who have spent years in the field, learning through experience, sweat, and quiet observation. Respect isn't something to be rationed according to hierarchy. It should be the blueprint for how we interact in every space, from boardrooms to construction sites. And perhaps most importantly, true leadership isn't about commanding from above, but about recognizing value wherever it's found, even in the very people we once overlooked. Malik Grayson didn't just build a tower, he built a legacy of equity, inclusion, and second chances. And in doing so, he proved that dignity is the most unshakable foundation of all. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on how easily we judge others by appearances, titles, or assumptions, then you're not alone. Malik Grayson's journey from overlooked laborer to respected CEO wasn't just about personal triumph. It was about confronting systemic arrogance and proving that humility, respect, and second chances can build far more than just buildings. They can build people. And Connor Whitman's transformation reminds us all that even the most hardened mind can change when faced with truth and given the opportunity to grow. At X Daily Stories, we share powerful emotional narratives that reveal uncomfortable truths, challenge stereotypes, and spotlight the kind of change our world desperately needs. Each story is crafted not just to entertain, but to inspire action, empathy, and conversation. So if you believe in storytelling that uplifts the unheard, exposes injustice, and leaves you thinking long after the credits roll, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Join a community of people who care deeply about stories that matter. Let's keep building a better world, one powerful story at a time. Subscribe now to X Daily Stories, because real change always starts with a story.